Welcome to the History Bards podcast. We are glad you are joining us. Today, we have the great privilege of featuring award-winning author Eliot Pattison, a writer of faraway mysteries. An international lawyer by training, early in his career, Pattison began writing on legal and business topics, producing several books and dozens of articles published on 3 continents. In the late 1990s, he decided to combine his deep concerns for the people of Tibet with his interest in venturing into fiction by writing. In 2015, Eliot Pattison received the prestigious Art of Freedom Award from the Tibet House, along with the likes of radio personality Ira Glass, singer Patti Smith, and actor Richard Gere for his human rights advocacy in Tibet. Pattison's longtime interest in another faraway place, the 18th century American wilderness and its woodland Indians, led to the launch of his Bone Rattler series, which quickly won critical acclaim for its poignant presentation of Scottish outcasts and Indians during the upheaval of the French and Indian Wars. So we are so excited to have you on the show today, Eliot. How are you today?
I'm great, Dee. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Great. Well, to start off with, since this interview is all about you and your books, can you tell us about your journey as a writer, basically who you are and what your books are about?
Sure. You covered a fair bit of it already, but I've been writing since I was really in high school, and wrote a lot of nonfiction through the years. Had the great opportunity of being a lawyer in international business, and so traveled around the world. Put on over 1 million miles, and my involvement in China and Tibet and Asian religion led me to write the Skull Mantra series. But I had always been interested in American history ever since, as a 7-year-old, I found my first arrowhead.
Oh,
So I had this passion about China and Tibet that I sort of addressed in the other series, but I had also had this passion about history, but also about American history, but also about the founding of America and how,
right.
and all these colonists, mostly from Britain, but not only, became American. And that's really what this series is about. It's taking people who are, sort of instinctively, habitually, in British culture, Scottish culture, and became something different. And how did that happen? And so it was, books so far it's 7 explore that.
Well, that sounds really fascinating, and I'm really interested in knowing, because I read your bio. Of course, I read your bio on your website and everything to get to know you and everything. But this whole this interest in Tibet, and then again, I know with the American history as well. But can you tell us a little bit more about why you were so interested in the Tibetan history?
Oh, in Tibetan history, sure. I had been studying Asian religion since college, and have been fascinated. Then like I said, I had the opportunity to travel into the region multiple times, and so I had an instinctive curiosity about Buddhism, and then Tibetan Buddhism, which is very distinctive and unique. And then I began to see the persecution of Tibetans firsthand, in visiting China, and it deeply struck me and alarmed me. And so that series of books really, weaves the theme of human rights repression in Tibet and how people, deal with that.
Right. Okay. Well, and then about your American books, so that's kind of vastly different, but I'm sure there was probably some very similar themes.
There's actually a lot of similar themes, and people do say, why would you write such different books? And my response is that if you think about it, they're not all that different. They're right. About my characters, and my focus in the Bone Rattler series is on the outcast, it's on the orphans, it's on the sort of the rejects of society. And there were a lot of them in the colonies because Europe, especially Britain, sent over their rejects.
Yes.
They were persecuted. The Native Americans, the Indians, have been battered by decades of exposure to the Europeans, and that's very similar to the Tibetans. Sort of there's a fundamental human rights issue going on with the Native Americans, and the repressive British government. That's very analogous to what goes on in Tibet and China, today. And then how do you deal? And also, they were deeply spiritual people, the natives, but also the Scottish Highlanders, who figure in my book, and a number of the others. Have deep spirituality, and that also plays into the mix. So you're the persecution of this ethnic minority with a deep culture or deep spirituality. It makes for a lot of interesting drama and juxtaposition.
Yeah, absolutely it does. And I'm sure it's very, very fascinating, the history that's behind both of these. So you talked a little bit about traveling there. I'm sure that really like enhanced your writing, because my motto is, if you can travel to the place that you're writing about, it really does lend to doing that in your writing. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that affected your writing?
Well, the in terms of China and Tibet,
Or or wherever you
oh, first of all,
even here in the States.
I visited. I go to both, but in China, I visited a lot of Buddhist temples and Tibetan temples and sections of Tibet, and saw firsthand. I mean, I was the first time I went into a Tibetan Buddhist temple. There were more policemen, Chinese policemen there than the priests, and I realized. And I sort of sat there and meditated and watched the priests who were performing some worship ceremonies at the altar of the Buddha, and the policemen started herding them out, like pushing them with batons out of the room. And after a while, and they kept looking at me, and finally I looked around and realized I was the only one there, and I was a Westerner, and they were doing that because of me.
Oh.
And that was pretty disturbing. They
Yeah.
want a Westerner to see these Tibetans, and they were basically repressing their worship, and so that really kind of got to me and caused me to dig in a lot deeper in the whole story of Tibetan persecution and what has become essentially a genocide. It's very complex. I could go on in that, but let me go back to the current series.
Right.
One thing about this series is that I agree with you. It's really important to visit when you can, and I can visit everywhere mentioned in the book, and I have. Okay, and also the prior book in the series was a lot of it was set in London, and I've spent a lot of time in London as well. But this book is in Massachusetts and New York. Massachusetts and New York, and it figures Boston and Marblehead and Salem, and then New York City and Hudson Valley, and and then a lot of places in those localities. The site of the Boston Massacre, the Boston Common, where the British troops were encamped. I mean, all of those places I have visited, most of them many times. And so I like to go and get, a very much a feeling. And I've been doing research in this, on American history ever since I was a kid. But I always, in every one of these books, I take it on myself to address something new, so that I have to learn a lot more. But one of my favorite things is I have a collection of 18th century newspapers, which you still find here and there. And so, like in Marblehead, I would sit, on the bench on the harbor, or watch the harbor, which figures a lot of the book in the early part of the book, and read a paper from 1770. And so that kind of really struck home and got a good feeling of the place and time.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's amazing that you're able to do that. So can you tell us a little bit about this series, the premise behind it, so that our listeners can know what the series is about?
So as I said, I really focus on what, from a high altitude view might be seen as the underbelly of the colonies, but meaning I focus a lot on criminals, on fugitives, on exiles, on rebels, on the Native Americans. In one of the books, there was a lot about Jews in America, and for example, a lot of these persecuted groups. But in a way, that was very indicative of colonial America, and so telling that story also helps to tell about the transformation that went on. And I had been writing the series for years when I discovered a quote from John Adams, which became the epigram in this current book. in I think it was 1818. It was in the early 19th century. Adams was looking back on the Revolution, and he wrote that the real revolution, didn't take place, didn't start with Lexington and Concord. It started many years before in the hearts and minds of the colonists. That was the real revolution. And that really reflects the essence of these books, the revolution that went on in the hearts and minds of the colonists that turned them into Americans.
Okay. Well, that's really, and that's really interesting that you said that, because I was fixing to kind of get into what you said on your website. I really love the thought-provoking questions you had about how historical novels can play an important role as history texts, or play just as an important role as history texts. And I wanted you to tell our listeners a little bit more about this and how it's important not to, how it helps us not ignore history.
Well, it's really important to know our past, and I've written a lot about that, and the history texts have become very sterile, or very antiseptic, or very ideological. Our past is incredibly complex, incredibly colorful, and so I really believe, and we basically have a real historical illiteracy in America. Only 13% of eighth graders test proficient in American history now, which is the lowest grades ever.
Yeah.
I believe at this point that the best way to learn history is biographies and historical fiction. The authentic historical fiction, and I try very hard to make mine very authentic. The history books teach us about our past from a macro level, chart tables and memorize dates and act as though it was all kind of preordained and planned and done in a logical sequence, which is not true, at all. And history is made by individuals, is made by people like us, and people, in fact, people who had our DNA back then. I mean, we're descendants of these people, and there was nothing preordained about the founding of America. It was a function of all these different forces that came together, and the way that hearts and minds were transformed, in the words of John Adams. So I'm kind of a zealot about pushing history, and feel that, in fact, I'm doing a post right now about the duty of the historical novelist to be authentic.
Yes. Yes, and I agree.
That's why I think a good historical novel really can capture history better, because it if it done right, it goes to your heart, not your brain. And so it's not about memorizing dates. It's about learning how people felt, and sympathize with them, and you begin to ask yourself, what would I do if I was in that situation? And that's how we need to understand our history. It's at that micro level, and you build up to the bigger issues.
Yeah, it reminds me of that's one of my favorite quotes about that history books tell you the facts, but historical fiction tells you how they felt. And
right.
So I really love that. And it's very, very true about this genre, and one of the reasons why I love it. So we would love for you, do you have like a favorite line or passage from one of your books that you would love to share with us?
So there's one, there's one that was taken, a very short one.
Okay.
That's without going into a lot of detail about the plot. There are escaped slaves, and my protagonist, and briefly, the protagonists are Duncan McCallum, the Scot, who was planning to be a doctor, studying at Edinburgh College, a famous medical school, and was arrested for aiding an aged uncle who had been a ardent Jacobite rebel. And Duncan is transported, instead of going to prison, he is transported to forced labor as an indentured servant for 7 years. And then there's Sarah Ramsey, who is he winds up being a servant to the Ramsey family. And Sarah is a very, very intelligent, very perceptive, very resourceful daughter of one of the most powerful families of England, except she was raised by the Mohawk. She was captured by the Mohawk when she was young and raised by the Mohawk. She hates her father, who's very, very arrogant, belligerent aristocrat in Britain. And then finally, the third character is Conewago, who is a native of a tribe that has basically gone extinct who's very old in this book. He was born in the late 1600s and witnessed an awful lot of the events of these ages. He had been sent to Europe by the Jesuits to be educated, so he's highly educated, more so than most of the colonists. And he for the purpose of coming back to help his people. But when he finally returned years later, his people had disappeared. He had no family left. He had no tribe left. And so there's a dynamic of tragedy, a tragic air about Conewago, but he's also very spirited and has become Duncan's sort of father figure. But back to the quote. So one of the escaped slaves is hanging. He's escaped from servitude in Barbados and joined Duncan's party, which is engaged in some secret work for the Sons of Liberty. And he's hanging on a ship sailing from Boston or sailing from Marblehead to New York. And in the nighttime, under the moonlight, he's hanging onto the shrouds, up in the rigging, leaning out over the ocean and laughing. And so Conewago is talking to Duncan, and he says, the Jesuits would say that Solomon's the ex-slave, is having an epiphany. He is detached from his past and discovered that the life behind him doesn't have to be the one before him. And that sort of captures a really important theme. It's fairly obviously applicable to the fugitive slaves who are making a new life for themselves, but also is very much, and Duncan reflects on those words later in the book, reflects the experience of the colonists generally, that what they had before, when they had their own personal sort of persecutions or hardships because of the culture and government in England, doesn't have to be what they have in America. And that's a lot about what the revolution does a lot to explain the revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's a great little tidbit that our listeners can look forward to whenever they're delving into your books. So can you tell us a little bit about, your journey as a writer? We'd love to hear about a writer's early days of writing. Is there anything that impacted you in your life, like something that you read or maybe some advice that you were given along your journey?
Well, there was the advice. It was indirect because it was Raymond Chandler, but he was saying that the important thing in writing is not technique. That's easy. The important thing is passion. And people do come to me. I've been around for a while, and people do come to me asking for advice. As a writer, and I'll tell them, read.
Yes.
Especially young. I had somebody from high school ask me recently, what could they do to become a writer? I said, just read. I lived on a farm, a fairly remote farm, as a boy, and my favorite thing in the world for years was the bookmobile, and
Yes.
down to these rural communities, like a portable library, on wheels, and it was amazing to me. It was just this treasure chest, and they would always be amazed because here it was, this little kid. I'm talking about like even in third, fourth, fifth grade, carrying out like 10 books every time. They would let me go over my limit, and that's how I learned about the world. In my early years. And the other thing is this point about passion, in a way that's very much related, because you read and develop interest, and that helps you focus.
Yes.
As I said about my books from China and Tibet, I had very much a passion about telling the story of the Tibetans, and I have a passion. I already had this huge interest and passion about American history, but in the last few years, where it feels like people keep attacking our past, like we have to feel guilty about our past, or we have to take revenge on the past. I now have a passion. It's even more of it sort of inflamed my passion to explain the founding and American history better to Americans.
Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. And so that kind of goes right along with, do you have a favorite saying or a quote that you live by? It kind of tells our listeners a little bit about you.
There's a quote that I love. It may be a little deep, but there was a Jesuit scientist who, which is an interesting combination, who was kind of a rebel himself, who lived in the early 20th century, named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And his quote that I love is, "We are not human beings having a spiritual existence. you're spiritual beings having a human existence. And I think there's a lot to that. I think maybe you begin to grasp this as as you grow older with more life experience, but you realize that the spiritual nature, would, however you may define it. It isn't necessarily religion or organized religion, but it's what's in your heart, what drives you, what makes you, the spark of your soul. That defines a lot of people's lives and how they deal with that, and the rest of it is just the physical experience. And you realize as you get older that the important stuff is almost all the spiritual stuff.
Yes, that's very true. Happy is he who's conscious of his spiritual need. Absolutely. So we would love to know, do you have anything coming up, like what's coming up for you, like releases or book events or book signings, so that if anybody's in the area, they can make sure and come out to see you?
Well, I think we're doing an event in Salem, Massachusetts in November, the week before Thanksgiving. I don't have details yet. It's Copper Dog is the bookstore that's sponsoring it.
Okay.
Probably the Thursday or Friday before Thanksgiving, the week before Thanksgiving. I have a number of posts I'm doing for various literary sites, and doing some public Zooms meetings, like with the Poison Pen Bookshop in early November 2nd, I think that is. Doing people in Pennsylvania. I am doing an appearance on a television station in Harrisburg on October 22nd, I believe it is. And so, we have a lot going on with the law.
Well, that's great. And we'll be sure and put your website on our description and on our website so that people can link back to it and find out about those events, so they can make sure if they're in the area that they can come by.
That's great. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we really appreciate you being on the show today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Dave.
Absolutely. We look forward to your upcoming books for this launch, for your series, and for the books in the series. And for all the fans listening in, you can learn more about Eliot and his books at www.eliotpattison.com. And you can find the link and more info in today's episode description. And as always, we thank everyone for listening, and please don't forget to subscribe. New episodes will be coming out every week, and our next episode features historical author Mari Ann Christie from the Shine with Paper Lanterns Writers Group. This is D.K. Marley with Eliot Pattison with the History Bards podcast. Keep making history and keep listening.